They thought I was their son's lawyer, so I played along. Now, he's begging me to defend him in court. The woman grabbed my arm in the hospital parking garage at 6:43 p.m. on a Friday, her manicured nails digging into my jacket sleeve hard enough to leave marks. "You're here for Ethan, aren't you?" she said, her voice cracking with desperation. "Thank God. They said you were coming, but we didn't know when. Please, we need to talk before they move him." I opened my mouth to explain she had the wrong person, that I was just a software engineer visiting my uncle on the 4th floor, that I'd never met anyone named Ethan in my life. But something about the raw fear in her eyes made me hesitate. She was maybe 55, expensive haircut, designer purse, the kind of polished exterior that was barely holding together some internal collapse. Behind her stood a man in a suit, older, gray at the temples, looking at me with the same desperate hope. "The consultation room is this way," the woman continued, already pulling me toward the elevator. "They're only giving us 20 minutes before they transport him to county. We need to know what our options are, what we're looking at. Please tell us he's not going to prison." I should have stopped her right then. Should have said there'd been a mistake, that I wasn't whoever she thought I was. Instead, I followed her into the elevator, my brain scrambling to make sense of what was happening. The man introduced himself as Richard Ashford. His wife was Patricia. Their son Ethan had been arrested 3 hours ago at this hospital after some kind of incident in the emergency room. They'd called their family attorney, someone named David Kowalski, who'd said he was sending an associate to consult with them immediately. That associate was apparently supposed to be me, except I was actually Nathan Cross, 32 years old, zero legal training, and completely unqualified for whatever situation I was walking into. The elevator doors opened on the 2nd floor, and Patricia led us down a hallway to a small consultation room. Through the window, I could see a young man in his 20s sitting on a gurney, one wrist handcuffed to the rail, a police officer standing nearby. The kid looked terrified, his face bruised, wearing a hospital gown spattered with what looked like blood. I'd been working late at the office for the past 6 months, pulling 12-hour days trying to meet a product launch deadline for the startup where I worked as lead developer. My life had become a blur of code and coffee and brief conversations with my girlfriend Allison, who kept saying we needed to talk about our future. That Friday, I'd left work early for the first time in weeks to visit my Uncle Frank, who'd had knee surgery that morning. He was doing fine, barely needed me there, but I'd promised my mom I'd check on him. I'd been walking back to my car, thinking about whether to grab dinner or just go home and crash, when Patricia Ashford had grabbed my arm and mistaken me for a lawyer. Looking back, there were a dozen moments where I could have corrected the error. When Patricia asked if David had briefed me on the case, I could have said I didn't know any David. When Richard asked about my experience with assault charges, I could have admitted I'd never set foot in a courtroom. But instead, I found myself nodding along, making non-committal sounds, letting them believe whatever they needed to believe. Patricia explained what had happened, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Ethan had been at a bar in downtown Seattle celebrating a friend's birthday. There had been some kind of altercation with another patron. Details were unclear, but it had escalated. The other man had followed Ethan outside, they'd fought, and Ethan had hit him hard enough to crack his skull against the pavement. The man was in surgery right now, 2 floors up, prognosis uncertain. Ethan had panicked and driven himself to this hospital, a different one, claiming he'd been mugged and needed treatment for his own injuries. But the story hadn't held up. The police had been called, and now Ethan was under arrest for felony assault, potentially attempted murder if the victim didn't make it. "David said this could be self-defense," Richard said, his voice steady but his hands shaking. "If the other man followed Ethan, if he started it, that changes everything, right? That's what you're here to establish?" I looked at Ethan through the window, at this scared kid whose entire future depended on what happened next, and I heard myself say, "I need to speak with your son. Alone." The police officer checked my non-existent credentials by asking my name and which firm I was with. I said, Nathan Cross, associate at Kowalski and Partners, the name Patricia had mentioned in the elevator. He wrote it down without questioning it, unlocked the door, and gave me 10 minutes. I walked into that room with no plan, no idea what I was doing, just a vague sense that I'd somehow ended up in a situation that was spiraling beyond my control. Ethan looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "You're my lawyer?" he asked, voice hoarse. "My parents hired you?" I sat down in the chair next to the gurney, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me to come clean, to admit the mistake, to get out before this got worse. But looking at this terrified kid, seeing the desperation in his face, I thought about my own younger brother who'd gotten into trouble in college, how scared he'd been, how much he'd needed someone to believe in him. "Tell me what happened," I said quietly. "Everything. Don't leave anything out." Ethan's story came out in fragments. He'd been drinking, not drunk, but definitely buzzed. Some guy at the bar, older, aggressive, had been hitting on Ethan's friend Melissa all night. Ethan had stepped in, told the guy to back off, words had been exchanged. The guy had followed them outside, shoved Melissa, and Ethan had shoved back. Then the guy had swung at him, connected with his jaw, and Ethan had responded with a punch that sent the man falling backward. The sound of his head hitting concrete had been sickening, Ethan said. Everyone had scattered. Ethan had driven away in a panic, realized he was bleeding from the hit he'd taken, and gone to this hospital instead of the one closer to the bar because he was scared. He'd lied to the intake nurse about being mugged because he thought if he told the truth, he'd be arrested immediately, which had happened anyway once the police connected the dots. I didn't mean to hurt him that bad, Ethan said, tears streaming down his face. I was just trying to protect Melissa. He wouldn't stop. What's going to happen to me? I should have told him right then that I wasn't a lawyer, that I couldn't help him, that his parents had made a mistake. Instead, I found myself saying, "Don't talk to anyone else about this. Not the police, not other inmates, nobody. Only speak to your actual attorney when he gets here. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded frantically. "David Kowalski is your family's lawyer. He'll handle this. I'm just here to make sure you don't say anything that could hurt your case before he arrives." It was the truth, sort of, delivered in a way that let Ethan continue believing I was part of his legal team. The police officer knocked on the door. Time was up. I stood, told Ethan to stay calm, and walked out of that room feeling like I'd just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Patricia and Richard were waiting in the hallway, their faces desperate for good news. "What did he say?" Patricia asked. "Can you help him?" I took a breath. This was the moment. Tell them the truth. Admit the mistake. Walk away. "Your actual attorney, David Kowalski, needs to be here as soon as possible," I said carefully. "This is a serious situation that requires experienced criminal defense counsel. I've advised Ethan not to speak to anyone until proper representation arrives." Richard's face fell. "But you're from David's firm. You are his representation. What are we looking at here? What should we expect?" And that's when I made the decision that would haunt me for months. Instead of correcting him, instead of admitting I was a fraud, I looked Richard Ashford in the eye and said, "Based on what Ethan told me, there may be a viable self-defense argument, but we need witness statements, security footage from the bar, medical reports on both Ethan and the victim. This is going to require significant investigation and preparation. The preliminary hearing is probably Monday morning. David will need to be there." Patricia grabbed my hand. "Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. David said he'd send his best, and clearly he did. You've given us hope." I extracted myself from her grip and headed toward the elevator, my heart pounding. I'd just impersonated an attorney, given legal advice I wasn't qualified to give, and inserted myself into a criminal case that could end with a man dying and a kid going to prison. The smart thing would have been to call the Ashfords as soon as I got to my car, explain the mistake, and disappear from their lives. But I didn't do that. Instead, I drove home to my apartment in Capitol Hill, poured myself a drink I didn't finish, and spent 3 hours researching Washington state assault laws, self-defense statutes, and what actually happened during preliminary hearings. I told myself I was just curious, just trying to understand what that kid was facing. But deep down, I knew I was looking for a way to justify what I'd done, to make sense of why I'd played along instead of coming clean. My phone buzzed around 11 p.m., a text from an unknown number. "Nathan, this is Patricia Ashford. Thank you again for meeting with us tonight. David called and said the preliminary hearing is Monday at 9 a.m. He wants you to attend since you've already consulted with Ethan. Hope that's okay. We're so grateful to have you on our side." I stared at that message for a solid 5 minutes. David Kowalski, the actual attorney, apparently wanted me at the hearing, which meant either he didn't realize I wasn't actually his associate, or the Ashfords had misrepresented who I was when they spoke to him. Either way, I was now expected to show up at a courthouse on Monday morning and continue this charade in front of a judge. The weekend was a blur of panic and research. I called the Kowalski and Partners office Saturday morning, planning to come clean, but got voicemail. Left a message saying I needed to speak to David urgently regarding the Ashford case. He called back 2 hours later. "Nathan, thanks for jumping in Friday night," he said, his voice rushed and distracted. "I was stuck in a deposition and couldn't get away. Patricia said you handled the initial consultation well. I need you to appear at the preliminary Monday to enter our notice of representation and get the discovery schedule. I'll take over after that, but I'm in trial all next week on another matter and can't be there. You good with that?" I opened my mouth to say no, absolutely not. There's been a terrible mistake. What came out instead was, "Sure, what do I need to know?" David spent 20 minutes briefing me on the case, the charges, what to expect at the preliminary. He seemed to assume I was an attorney, maybe someone newly hired at his firm, someone who knew basic courtroom procedure. Everything he said went over my head, legal jargon I barely understood, references to rules and motions and procedures I'd only seen on TV. When he finished, he said, "Just enter our appearance, get the dates, and don't let Ethan talk to the prosecutor. Easy stuff. We'll regroup after the weekend." I spent the rest of Saturday and all of Sunday essentially getting a crash course in criminal law from YouTube videos, legal blogs, and whatever free resources I could find online. I learned what a preliminary hearing actually was, a proceeding where the prosecution had to show probable cause that a crime occurred and the defendant committed it. I learned that defense attorneys usually just showed up, entered their appearance, and scheduled future hearings without arguing much at this stage. I learned enough to maybe, possibly, not completely humiliate myself in front of a judge if I just kept my mouth shut and followed the script David had given me. Monday morning arrived with the weight of a cement block on my chest. I put on my best suit, the one I wore to job interviews and funerals, and drove to the King County Courthouse. The building was intimidating, all marble and security, and people who actually knew what they were doing rushing past with briefcases and determined expressions. I found the courtroom, saw Patricia and Richard sitting in the gallery looking exhausted, saw Ethan in an orange jumpsuit being led in by deputies. And I saw the prosecutor, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an expression that said she ate defense attorneys for breakfast. The judge, Honorable Margaret Keene, looked like she'd been doing this for 1,000 years, completely unimpressed by anything happening in her courtroom. When the bailiff called the Ashford case, I stood up on shaking legs and approached the defense table. The prosecutor, who'd introduced herself as Deputy Prosecutor Laura Hensley, 16 years with the county, gave me a quick once-over and returned her attention to her notes. The judge looked at me. "Counsel, state your appearance for the record." This was it, the moment of truth. I could still come clean, admit the mistake, face whatever consequences came from impersonating an attorney. Or I could say the words David had coached me to say and hope nobody asked questions I couldn't answer. Nathan Cross appearing on behalf of defendant Ethan Ashford, Your Honor, Kowalski and Partners. The judge made a note. And the state? Laura Hensley stated her appearance, then launched into a recitation of the charges against Ethan. Assault in the second degree with intent to cause bodily harm. The victim, Gregory Vance, was currently in intensive care with a fractured skull and brain bleed. Prognosis remained uncertain. The state was prepared to present evidence of probable cause. I listened as Laura called her first witness, a police officer who'd responded to the scene outside the bar. He testified about finding blood on the pavement, interviewing witnesses who'd seen Ethan punch Gregory, and later arresting Ethan at the hospital when his story about being mugged didn't match the evidence. Then came the bartender from that night, who testified that Ethan and Gregory had exchanged words inside before going outside. The bartender hadn't seen the actual fight, but had seen Gregory following Ethan's group out the door. Everything the witnesses said seemed to support the prosecution's narrative that Ethan had assaulted someone and fled, then lied about it. I sat there taking notes I didn't understand, trying to look like I knew what I was doing, while internally screaming. When Laura rested, the judge turned to me. "Does the defense wish to present any evidence at this time?" David's instructions echoed in my head. "Don't argue at the preliminary. Just get the dates and get out." "No, Your Honor. Defense reserves." The judge found probable cause and scheduled the arraignment for 2 weeks out. Set bail at $100,000, reminded Ethan of his rights. The whole thing took maybe 30 minutes, and I'd barely said 10 words, but I'd done it. I'd successfully impersonated a lawyer in a court of law, which was, I was pretty sure, itself a crime. After the hearing, Patricia and Richard cornered me in the hallway, thanking me profusely for representing their son. Ethan had been transferred to county jail pending bail, which they were working on posting. They asked me what happened next, what our strategy would be, how confident I was about the self-defense argument. I deflected as best I could, saying I needed to coordinate with David, that we'd have a clearer picture once we reviewed all the evidence. I promised to stay in touch and extracted myself before they could ask more questions I couldn't answer. I walked to my car feeling sick, my hands trembling as I started the engine. I'd crossed another line, this one in front of a judge, on the record, in a case where a man might die and a kid might go to prison. And the worst part was, some small part of me felt exhilarated by the fact that I'd pulled it off, that I'd stood in a courtroom and played the role convincingly enough that nobody questioned it. I called David Kowalski from my car, intending to finally admit the truth. He answered on the first ring, sounding harried. "Nathan, how'd it go?" "We got the arraignment date, 2 weeks from today. Bail is set at $100,000. "Good. Listen, I need you to handle the arraignment too. This trial I'm in is going longer than expected. You comfortable with that?" "No," I wanted to scream. "I'm not comfortable with any of this because I'm not actually a lawyer, and you've been operating under the mistaken assumption that I work for you when actually I'm a software engineer who got mistaken for your associate in a hospital parking garage and was too much of a coward to correct the error before it spiraled completely out of control. But what I said was, I should probably brief you on the case in person. Can we meet this week?" David sighed. "I'm slammed until the arraignment. Let's connect right after. In the meantime, review the discovery when the prosecutor sends it over. Start building the defense file. You know the drill." He hung up before I could respond. I sat in the courthouse parking lot, my phone in my hand, and faced the reality of my situation. I was now the de facto attorney on a serious criminal case. The Ashfords thought I was qualified to defend their son. David Kowalski thought I was one of his associates. Ethan was sitting in jail trusting that I knew what I was doing. And the actual truth, that I had no legal training whatsoever, was a bomb that would destroy everyone's lives if it came out. The smart play was to come clean immediately. Call David, explain the mistake, let him assign a real attorney to the case. But I kept thinking about the gratitude in Patricia's eyes, the hope in Ethan's face, the fact that I'd actually managed to get through that preliminary hearing without anyone catching on. Some delusional part of my brain started wondering if maybe I could pull this off, if maybe I could maintain the pretense long enough to help this kid without anyone discovering I was a fraud. I spent the next 2 weeks living a double life. During the day, I went to work at the software company, wrote code, attended meetings, pretended everything was normal. In the evenings and weekends, I became Nathan Cross, attorney at law, researching case law about self-defense, reviewing Washington state criminal procedures, learning everything I could about how to defend someone against assault charges. The discovery package arrived from the prosecutor's office via email. Police reports, witness statements, security footage from the bar, medical records for both Ethan and Gregory Vance. I spent hours going through everything, and what I found was complicated. Yes, Gregory had followed Ethan's group outside. Yes, there'd been some kind of confrontation. But the witness statements were inconsistent about who'd thrown the first punch, and the security footage didn't capture the actual fight, just the aftermath. Gregory Vance remained in critical condition, which meant the charges against Ethan could be upgraded to attempted murder or manslaughter if he died. The medical reports showed Ethan had sustained minor injuries, a split lip and bruising, consistent with being in a fight, but nothing that clearly indicated he'd been defending himself from serious harm. The more I learned, the more I realized this case wasn't the clear-cut self-defense scenario the Ashfords believed it to be. Ethan had definitely hit Gregory hard enough to cause life-threatening injuries, and proving that was justified was going to require more legal skill than I possessed. I met with Ethan 3 times at the county jail before the arraignment. Each visit required me to sign in as his attorney, another layer of documented fraud. We went over his version of events repeatedly. He insisted Gregory had swung first, that he'd feared for his safety and Melissa's, that the punch had been instinctive. But when I pressed him on details, his story started to shift. Maybe Gregory hadn't actually hit him first. Maybe Ethan had pushed him, and then Gregory had pushed back, and then Ethan had thrown the punch. The more we talked, the less certain I became about the self-defense argument, and the more certain I became that I was in way over my head. The arraignment arrived on a Wednesday morning. I showed up at the courthouse in my suit, briefcase full of notes I'd compiled, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. Ethan was brought in looking thinner, more haunted than at the preliminary. Patricia and Richard sat in the gallery along with a few other family members who gave me encouraging nods. The proceedings were straightforward. The judge read the charges, Ethan pleaded not guilty, and I entered our formal plea and requested a trial date. The prosecutor, Laura Hensley, asked for expedited scheduling given the severity of the victim's injuries. The judge set a trial date for 6 weeks out, which sent my stomach into free fall. 6 weeks to prepare for a trial I had no business conducting, to maintain a lie that was growing more elaborate by the day, to somehow navigate a criminal justice system I barely understood. After the arraignment, Patricia pulled me aside. David said you're going to be lead on this case, that he trusts you completely to handle Ethan's defense. Is that true? I should have said no right then. Should have admitted that David barely knew who I was, that there'd been a terrible misunderstanding, that I was the least qualified person in the building to defend her son. Instead, I nodded. We're working together on strategy. David's expertise is invaluable, but yes, I'll be handling the day-to-day work on the case. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. You don't know what this means to us. We've been so scared, but having you in our corner makes us feel like Ethan has a fighting chance. That conversation should have been my wake-up call, the moment I realized I was doing more harm than good by continuing this charade. But I'd become invested in the lie, in the identity I'd created, in the impossible task of trying to help this family without admitting I was a fraud. I called David Kowalski that evening, finally ready to come clean. His secretary said he was out of town on a case, wouldn't be back for 2 weeks. Could she take a message? I left my number and said it was urgent regarding the Ashford matter. He never called back. A week after the arraignment, I got a call from an investigator named Raymond Fields, 23 years doing defense work, who said David had hired him to work the Ashford case. Ray wanted to meet to discuss strategy, to coordinate on witness interviews and evidence gathering. I met him at a coffee shop near my office, my stomach in knots, certain this would be the moment my deception unraveled. Ray was maybe 60, ex-cop turned private investigator, sharp eyes that had seen everything. He pulled out a file and started talking about the case like I knew what I was doing, asking my opinion on which witnesses to prioritize, what forensic evidence to challenge, how to establish reasonable doubt. I improvised, drawing on everything I'd learned from my frantic research, making suggestions that sounded legal-ish without committing to anything specific. Ray nodded along, making notes, treating me like a colleague rather than the imposter I was. Before we wrapped up, he said something that made my blood run cold. I've worked with David for 15 years. He mentioned you're new to criminal defense, transitioning from corporate law. That right? I hadn't known I was supposed to have a backstory, hadn't realized David had filled in gaps about who I was to explain why I was suddenly handling a major criminal case. That's right, I said carefully. Still getting my footing in this area of practice. Ray smiled. You'll do fine. You've got good instincts. And honestly, this case isn't as complicated as it seems. We find a few witnesses who will testify Gregory was the aggressor, establish that Ethan reasonably feared for his safety, and we've got our self-defense claim. The prosecution's case is circumstantial. They can't prove intent beyond reasonable doubt. You'll see when we get to trial. Except I wouldn't see, because I'd never been to a trial, never cross-examined a witness, never made an opening statement or objected to evidence. I was playing a role I'd learned from television and internet research, and when we actually got to trial, the entire house of cards was going to collapse spectacularly. That night, I finally told someone the truth. Allison came over to my apartment, noticed I'd been distant and distracted for weeks, and demanded to know what was wrong. I'd been keeping the Ashford case secret from everyone in my life, unable to explain where I'd been spending my time or why I was so stressed. So, I told her everything. The mistaken identity, the decision to play along, the preliminary hearing and arraignment, the trial date looming 6 weeks away. She stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Nathan, you have to tell them. You have to come clean before this gets worse." I explained that it was already too late, that I'd signed documents, appeared in court, taken actions that made me criminally liable for fraud and unauthorized practice of law, that if I admitted the truth now, I'd probably face charges, definitely face lawsuits, and Ethan would be left scrambling to find new representation right before trial. Allison was quiet for a long time. "You realize you could go to prison for this? Not might. Could. What you're doing is serious." I knew. God, I knew. But I also knew that coming clean meant destroying the Ashfords' trust, abandoning Ethan when he needed help, and facing consequences that would ruin my life. So instead, I kept digging deeper, kept pretending, kept hoping somehow I could navigate this impossible situation without everything exploding. The next month was a nightmare of preparation I wasn't qualified to do. Ray interviewed witnesses and found 3 people willing to testify that Gregory had been aggressive that night, that he'd followed Ethan's group outside with clear hostile intent. The bartender gave a more detailed statement suggesting Gregory had been looking for a fight. Medical experts reviewed the injuries and concluded the force Ethan used, while resulting in severe harm, wasn't necessarily disproportionate to the threat he'd faced. On paper, we were building a decent self-defense case. But I knew that actually presenting that case in court, actually going toe-to-toe with an experienced prosecutor in front of a judge and jury, was beyond my capabilities. I started having panic attacks, waking up at 3 a.m. drenched in sweat, my mind racing through all the ways this could go wrong. I researched what happened to people who practiced law without a license. The penalties were severe: criminal charges, massive fines, civil liability for any harm caused. I looked into whether there was any way to transfer the case to another attorney without revealing my fraud, but there wasn't. Any competent lawyer would review the file, see my name on the court documents, and immediately start asking questions I couldn't answer. 3 weeks before trial, David Kowalski finally called me back. "Nathan, sorry for the delay. I've been underwater with this trial just wrapped yesterday. How's the Ashford case looking?" This was my moment. Tell him the truth. Admit everything. Face the consequences like an adult instead of a coward. "We need to meet in person," I said. "There's something about the case we need to discuss. Something important." David suggested coffee the next morning. I spent the entire night rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd explain what had happened, how I'd beg for mercy and hope he'd handle the fallout with some degree of compassion. I arrived at the coffee shop 30 minutes early, my hands shaking, my mind running through worst-case scenarios. David showed up looking exactly like I'd imagined, mid-50s, expensive suit, confident stride. We sat down, and he immediately started talking about trial strategy, about how he'd reviewed Ray's witness statements and thought we had a strong case, about how he was impressed with the work I'd done building the defense. "I'll be honest," he said. "When Patricia Ashford called me that Friday night saying she'd already met with one of my associates at the hospital, I had no idea who she was talking about. But then, when you showed up at the preliminary and handled it professionally, I figured you must be the new guy the firm hired while I was in trial. Sorry I haven't had time to properly introduce myself. Welcome to Kowalski and Partners." My mind went blank. David thought I worked for his firm. Not as an associate he'd personally hired, but as someone else at the firm had brought on board, someone he hadn't met yet because he'd been too busy. Which meant the window for coming clean was even narrower than I'd thought, because now I'd have to admit I'd deceived not just the Ashfords, but David himself for weeks. "David," I started, my voice shaking. "There's something I need to tell you about how I got involved in this case." His phone rang. He glanced at it, grimaced. "I have to take this. My other client, emergency situation. Can we table this conversation until after the Ashford trial? 3 weeks, we'll have more time to talk about your role at the firm, get you properly onboarded. For now, just keep doing what you're doing. You're doing great work." He answered his phone and walked away, leaving me sitting there with my confession stuck in my throat. I'd had my chance and failed to take it. Again. That afternoon, I got a call from Ethan. He'd been released on bail 2 weeks earlier, staying with his parents, working with Ray on preparing for trial. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for believing in me when I know how bad this looks. My parents told me you're going to be the one actually defending me at trial, that David trusts you to handle it. I just want you to know that means everything." I couldn't speak. Couldn't find words that wouldn't either perpetuate the lie or shatter everything. Ethan continued. "I've been thinking a lot about that night, about what I did, and I know I messed up. I know I hurt someone badly, and I'll have to live with that forever. But I also know I was scared, and I was trying to protect my friend, and I didn't mean for it to go that far. I'm hoping the jury will understand that. I'm hoping you can make them understand that." He was counting on me. This kid whose life hung in the balance was putting his faith in someone who had no business being anywhere near a courtroom, And I'd let it get this far because I'd been too proud, too scared, too invested in the lie to do the right thing. 2 weeks before trial, Gregory Vance died. The brain bleed had caused complications, he'd never regained consciousness, and his family had made the decision to remove life support, which meant the charges against Ethan were immediately upgraded to second-degree murder. Laura Hensley called me personally to inform me of the new charges and the adjusted trial schedule. "I'm sorry it came to this," she said, and she sounded genuine. "But your client killed someone. We're going to prosecute accordingly." The murder charge changed everything. What had been a serious assault case with possibility of self-defense was now a homicide, and the stakes had gone from years in prison to life in prison. I met with the Ashfords that evening at their home in Bellevue, a sprawling house that spoke to wealth and privilege and parents who'd do anything to protect their son. Patricia was hysterical, Richard was stoic, but clearly shattered, and Ethan looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 hours. "Can we still argue self-defense?" Richard asked me. "Does Gregory's death change our strategy?" "Legally, no," I wanted to say. Self-defense is self-defense regardless of the outcome. But I didn't say that because I wasn't actually sure if that was true, wasn't certain how the upgraded charge affected our approach, wasn't qualified to be giving them advice on something this serious. "We'll need to adjust our presentation to account for the severity of the outcome," I said carefully. "But our core argument remains the same. Ethan acted in response to a perceived threat. The fact that Gregory died doesn't change what Ethan believed in the moment." It sounded good. Legalish. The kind of thing a real attorney might say. Patricia seemed somewhat reassured, though her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Before I left, she pulled me aside. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." My heart stopped. This was it. She knew. She'd figured it out. "Of course," I managed. "Are you confident you can win this case? Because if you have any doubts, if there's any chance Ethan would be better served by bringing in more experienced counsel, I need to know now. I'm his mother. I'll do whatever it takes to save him." This was my out. My chance to admit I wasn't qualified, to recommend they hire a real criminal defense attorney, to extract myself from this nightmare before it destroyed everyone. I looked at Patricia's desperate face, at Ethan sitting on the couch looking lost, at Richard standing by the window with his shoulders slumped in defeat. And I thought about the defense we'd built, the witnesses Ray had found, the evidence that suggested Ethan had genuinely feared for his safety. A real attorney could present that case effectively. But would the Ashfords trust a new attorney, brought in at the last minute, the way they trusted me? Would Ethan feel as comfortable with a stranger as he did with the person who'd been working his case from the beginning? "I'm confident in our defense," I said, "and I'll do everything in my power to get the best possible outcome for your son." It was the last lie I told before everything fell apart. The week before trial, I had a meeting with Laura Hensley to discuss a potential plea deal. She'd offered second-degree manslaughter, 12 years with possibility of parole after 8. It was a significantly reduced sentence from what Ethan faced if convicted at trial, but it still meant the better part of a decade in prison. I presented the offer to the Ashfords and Ethan in David's conference room, which I'd been using for client meetings because nobody at the firm seemed to question my presence there. Ethan's immediate reaction was to reject it. "I'm not pleading guilty to killing someone when I was defending myself. We have witnesses. We have evidence. I want to go to trial." Richard agreed. "We didn't hire you to negotiate a plea. We hired you to fight for our son's innocence." But Patricia was less certain. 12 years is a long time, but it's not life. What are his chances at trial? Really? I should have told her I had no idea, that I'd never tried a case, that my assessment of his chances was based entirely on what I'd learned from legal podcasts and YouTube videos. Instead, I pulled out the trial preparation materials Ray and I had compiled and walked them through our strategy. Opening statement establishing Ethan as the real victim. Witness testimony about Gregory's aggression. Expert analysis of the injuries suggesting proportional response. Closing argument emphasizing reasonable doubt and the right to self-defense. It all sounded convincing when laid out on paper. Ethan decided to reject the plea. 3 days before trial, I got a call from someone named Jennifer Liu, staff attorney at the Washington State Bar Association. "Mr. Cross, I'm calling regarding an inquiry we received about your bar admission status. Could you confirm your bar number for our records?" My entire body went numb. Someone had reported me. Someone had checked whether I was actually licensed to practice law and discovered I wasn't. This was it. The end. Everything exposed. "Can I ask what this is regarding?" I managed to say through the panic. "It's routine verification for a case you're reportedly handling. The King County Prosecutor's Office does random compliance checks on defense attorneys in major cases. Should just take a moment to clear up." Laura Hensley had flagged me. She'd done her due diligence, checked that opposing counsel was properly credentialed, and discovered there was no Nathan Cross admitted to the Washington State Bar. I hung up without answering and immediately called David Kowalski, ready to confess everything. His secretary said he was in court all day, couldn't be reached. I called Ray Fields. Voicemail. I sat in my apartment, my life imploding around me, and realized I had maybe 24 hours before the Bar Association followed up, before someone contacted the court, before the truth came out in the most catastrophic way possible. I could run, pack a bag, drain my bank account, disappear before the consequences caught up with me. But that would leave Ethan without an attorney 3 days before trial, would destroy any chance he had at mounting a defense. Or I could come clean immediately, call the Ashfords, call David, call the court, and admit everything before someone else exposed me. Face the criminal charges, the lawsuits, the complete destruction of my life with whatever dignity I could muster. Or I could try one last desperate play. I called Jennifer Lou back. When she answered, I said, "There's been a clerical error. I was recently admitted to the bar after transferring from another state, and the paperwork hasn't been fully processed yet. Let me get you the documentation." I knew this would buy me maybe a day, maybe less, before she discovered I was lying. But a day was all I needed to do the right thing. I called Patricia Ashford. "We need to meet tonight, all of you. There's something I need to tell you about the case, and it can't wait." They agreed to come to a coffee shop near their house at 7 p.m. I spent the afternoon writing out a confession, documenting everything that had happened from the mistaken identity in the parking garage to this moment. When I walked into that coffee shop at 6:58 p.m., I was ready to face the consequences of what I'd done. The Ashfords arrived together, looking worried. Ethan had dark circles under his eyes. Patricia looked like she hadn't slept in days. Richard's usual composure was cracking. We sat down at a corner table, and I pulled out the document I'd prepared. "Before I explain what this is, I need you to know that everything I'm about to tell you is the truth. Complete honesty. No more deception." Patricia's face went pale. "What's wrong? Is it the case? Did something happen with the prosecutor?" I took a breath. This was it. No more lies. I'm not a lawyer. I never have been. The night we met in the hospital parking garage, there was a mistake. Your family attorney, David Kowalski, had arranged to send an associate to meet with you. I'm not that person. I was just visiting my uncle, and Patricia mistook me for the attorney you were expecting. Instead of correcting the error immediately, I let you believe I was qualified to help. And then I kept lying, kept pretending, kept digging deeper until I'd committed fraud against you, against the court, against everyone involved in this case. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's mouth opened and closed without sound. Richard's face turned red, then white. Ethan just stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "You're not a lawyer," Richard finally said, his voice dangerous and quiet. "Then what are you?" "I'm a software engineer. I have a degree in computer science. I've never been to law school, never taken the bar exam, never practiced law in any capacity. Everything I did on this case, every court appearance, every piece of legal advice, it was all fraud. And I'm so sorry. I should have told you immediately. I should have come clean the moment Patricia grabbed my arm that night. Instead, I let my ego and my fear and my stupid desire to help guide me into making decisions that have put your son's entire future at risk." Patricia started crying. Not quiet tears, but body-shaking sobs. Richard stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Do you understand what you've done? My son is going to trial for murder in 3 days, and his attorney isn't actually an attorney. Everything you've done, every filing, every strategy session, it's all invalid. We have to start over from scratch with less than 72 hours to prepare." Ethan was still staring at me, his expression unreadable. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why would you do this?" I didn't have a good answer. Because I was selfish. Because I wanted to feel important. Because I convinced myself I could help and lost sight of how much harm I was causing. "I don't know," I admitted. I told myself I was trying to help, but really I was just too cowardly to admit my mistake and face the consequences. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. But I am truly sorry." Richard pulled out his phone. "I'm calling David right now, and then I'm calling the police. What you did is criminal. You're going to face charges for this." I nodded. "I know. I'm ready to accept whatever consequences come. But first, you need to know that the case itself is solid. Ray Fields, the investigator, he's legitimate. The witnesses he found, the evidence we compiled, the defense strategy, all of that is real. A real attorney can use everything we built. Ethan still has a chance if you act quickly." Patricia looked up, her face streaked with tears and rage. "How dare you talk about his chances after what you've done? How dare you?" She was right. I had no right to offer advice, no right to suggest anything. I destroyed their trust completely. David answered Richard's call, and I listened as Richard explained what had happened, his voice shaking with fury. David's response was loud enough that I could hear it across the table. Shock, then anger, then frantic problem-solving. He said he'd contact the court immediately, file an emergency motion for continuance, assign his senior associate to take over the case. The trial would likely be delayed while new counsel got up to speed, which meant Ethan would spend more time living under the shadow of murder charges, more time waiting to learn his fate. All because of my deception. The police arrived 20 minutes later. 2 officers who listened as Richard explained the situation, who took my statement, who placed me under arrest for unauthorized practice of law and fraud. As they put handcuffs on my wrists, I looked at Ethan one last time. "For what it's worth, I believe you were defending yourself that night. I believe you didn't mean for Gregory to die. And I hope whoever ends up representing you can make a jury believe it too." He didn't respond. Just watched as they led me away, his future uncertain, his family devastated, all because I'd been too proud and too stupid to admit a simple mistake when it could have been easily corrected. The criminal charges came fast and severe: unauthorized practice of law, fraud, criminal impersonation. The Washington State Bar Association filed an ethics complaint, even though I'd never been a member to begin with. David Kowalski filed a malpractice suit on behalf of the Ashfords, seeking damages for the harm my deception had caused. The media picked up the story, local news running pieces about the fake lawyer who'd infiltrated a murder case, painting me as either a con artist or a delusional fantasist depending on the outlet. My employer fired me immediately once they learned about the arrest. Allison left me, unable to reconcile the person she thought she knew with someone capable of such sustained deception. I pleaded guilty to all charges. Didn't try to fight it, didn't make excuses. At sentencing, the Ashfords gave victim impact statements. Patricia talked about the betrayal, about trusting someone with her son's life, only to learn it had all been a lie. Richard detailed the financial and emotional cost of having to rebuild a defense from scratch with days to spare. Ethan's statement was the hardest to hear. "I thought Nathan believed in me," he said, his voice steady but hollow. "I thought someone finally saw me as more than just a screw-up who'd made a terrible mistake. Turns out he was just playing a role, and I was too desperate to see it. I don't know if I'll ever trust anyone again." The judge sentenced me to 18 months in county jail, 5 years probation, $75,000 in restitution to the Ashfords, and community service. It was less than the maximum, but more than enough to ensure my life as I'd known it was over. I served 14 months, got out on good behavior, and emerged into a world where my name was synonymous with fraud. No software company would hire me. My professional reputation was destroyed. I moved back in with my mother in Spokane, worked odd jobs, tried to rebuild some semblance of a life. 6 months after my release, I got a letter forwarded from my old address. It was from Ethan. The trial had eventually gone forward with David's senior associate as lead counsel. They'd used the defense strategy Ray and I had built, presented the witnesses we'd found, argued the self-defense claim we'd developed. The jury had deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict of not guilty on the murder charge, guilty on involuntary manslaughter. Ethan had been sentenced to 4 years, served 18 months, and was now out on parole. "I wanted you to know," he wrote, "that despite everything you did wrong, some of what you did helped. The case you built gave my actual lawyer something to work with. I'm not saying I forgive you, because what you did was unforgivable. But I wanted you to know that I'm okay. I'm rebuilding. And I hope you are too, even though you probably don't deserve it." I read that letter 10 times, crying by the end. I destroyed so much, hurt so many people, all because I couldn't admit a simple mistake. But Ethan was okay. He'd survived, despite me, maybe partly because of me, though I'd never claim credit for that. He was getting his life back, which was more than I'd given myself permission to hope for. 2 years after everything fell apart, I'm working at a community center teaching basic computer skills to people re-entering the workforce after incarceration. It's the only job I could get that didn't require references or background checks beyond the basic disclosure of my criminal record. I make barely enough to live on, will be paying restitution to the Ashfords for the next decade, and will carry the weight of what I did for the rest of my life. I think about that night in the hospital parking garage constantly. How easy it would have been to just say, "I'm sorry, you have the wrong person." 3 seconds of honesty that would have prevented months of deception and years of consequences. I played lawyer because it made me feel important, because I wanted to be the hero in someone else's story, because I was too cowardly to admit I didn't belong. Ethan begged me to defend him in court, and I tried, and I failed in the worst way possible. The system worked despite me, not because of me, and now I live with that knowledge every single day. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.